opportunities. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Kyle Emerick, who's here at Tufts in the economics department. He recently graduated from Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and focuses on India, agriculture, and today we'll be talking about flooding and agriculture based upon a 2-year study in India. Please join me in welcoming him.
Okay, wow, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to come down 2 flights of stairs and give a talk. It's quite nice, especially since my undergraduate intermediate micro course is meeting upstairs right as we speak. So I get to talk about my research instead of intermediate micro, which is very fun. And it's also the first time that I've given a talk that has a live webcast, so I'm deeply touched by such things. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is technological progress in Indian agriculture. And I'm going to talk about mostly one research project which fits into a category of several ongoing research projects, but I'm going to focus on one. It's joint work with 2 economists, Alain de Janvry and Elizabeth Saudelet, who are at Berkeley, as well as a entomologist / social scientist / everything, Manzoor Dar, who's at the International Rice Research Institute in, he's based in Delhi, but IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute, is in the Philippines, okay? So I want to start by saying that in developing country agriculture, farms tend to be small, and these small farms tend to be exposed to a lot of environmental risk, okay? There's a lot of things that can go bad with a small farmer, and weather risk is one of those important things, okay? So agriculture in, say, rural India is often rain-fed. That means farmers plant their crop, they wait for the rain to come. If the rain doesn't come, it can be really bad, okay? So they're absorbing a fair amount of risk just by being engaged in agriculture. And of course, food production overall depends very much on how good the rain is. So year to year, food production and food security can vary with what falls out of the sky, okay? Now, there's two channels through which, if we think about it economically a little bit, this can influence agricultural productivity. So there's the first, which is, well, if the rain doesn't come, crops are unhealthy, they look bad, food production decreases, okay? So that's very straightforward. The second, which I call self-insurance, is that, well, farmers don't maybe like this risk so much that comes when they decide to plant their crop and they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know how good the rain is going to be. They maybe don't like that. So they might do some things in a very conservative way to protect themselves from that very risk, okay? So this is what I call self-insurance. So what this does is, well, you know, maybe I cultivate a little less land, maybe I use a little bit less fertilizer because I'm worried that if I put a lot of fertilizer, I put a lot of effort into my crop, and then the rain doesn't come, the crop dies, I've invested all of this effort, and I've got nothing, okay? So this is a sort of mechanism where farmers are just insuring themselves based on their actions against this bad state, okay? So I want to focus pretty much entirely on this second mechanism, which has been touched on a little bit in the econ literature, but not a huge amount. So what are these things? What are these things that farmers might do, as I said? Well, they might choose the type of crop that they grow somewhat strategically. They might grow the one that, well, if the bad weather comes, you know, maybe it's not hurt as much, but if the good weather is there, you know, it's lower in its productivity, so it's reducing the variance in productivity over time, right? But at the cost of giving you a bad crop or a less productive crop in a good year, okay? So they're smoothing their productivity, but there's a cost to that, right? If the weather turns out to be good, not going to get as much. They might, as I said, change their input use or how they manage the farm in general. So they just put less effort in farming. And there's a lot of evidence, if you look in sort of very remote parts of, say, India where I do work, that there's some sort of anecdotal evidence that this is true. Farmers tend to not invest a lot, okay, in their crops, put a very low amount of effort. And one of the potential reasons for this is, well, there's a lot of risk in doing that, okay? So the research question with this approach, or with this motivation, I should say, is that if we have some better technologies, that is, if we have technological progress that actually reduces the risk to farmers, that is, we have, say, some sort of technology that reduces their year-to-year variation in production, can that actually make them make less conservative decisions? Maybe now they decide, okay, I'll put a little bit more effort into my farm. I'll throw a few more inputs onto the farm because I'm not worried as much. I'm not worried as much now that if the bad thing comes, that is the rain doesn't fall, my crop is going to be devastated. Okay? So in particular, so let me move from sort of high level to a little bit less high level and say that this form of technological progress that I'm going to talk about is a new type of rice. It's a new rice variety that is very similar to what farmers have, but it's got one nice property, and that nice property is its flood tolerance. And what does that mean? Well, rice is often grown in very low-lying areas, right, where the water comes and collects, because rice is a thirsty crop. It needs water to grow. But as a consequence of being in these low-lying areas where the water collects, the rainwater collects, well, if there's too much rainwater, then the whole rice paddy gets flooded. And although rice likes water, it doesn't like to be fully submerged. Okay? So this new flood-tolerant rice is sort of more resilient and can handle being fully submerged for a certain period of time. Okay? So it's a technological innovation. And we want to answer, well, does this actually push farmers away from making these conservative decisions that people say they make? That is, do they actually use a few more inputs? And those inputs are, well, fertilizer, land. Does it change the way that they plant the rice? That is, do you invest more with this new technology when it comes time to plant the rice? Okay? And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about, well, what's one thing farmers can do to deal with this uninsured risk that they have? They're growing rice. At the end of the year, you have a bunch of rice. You can either sell that rice or you can save it for your own household consumption. Well, if you're worried about what's going to happen next year, that is, maybe if I have a good crop this year, next year, I don't know, it might be a bad crop. You might save a fair amount of your good crop just in the event that next year turns out to be bad. Rice is storable, right? So you have a bunch of rice that you can eat if next year turns out to be a bad year. Okay? So that's what I mean when I say grain storage. We'll look at, well, does this technology actually reduce the need to use this, as we would call it, precautionary savings mechanism? So let me talk about the experiment. Okay, then what I'll do is I'll tell you, it's a 2-year experiment, so very conveniently, I'll first tell you about some results from year 1, then some results from year 2. I won't tell you about any alternative explanations because I decided those weren't that exciting for today's talk. And then we'll just conclude, and we'll have a little, question and answer session. So let me tell you about the technology. The technology is called Swarna Sub 1. Well, what does this mean? Swarna is a type of rice that farmers grow. It's very popular in South Asia, particularly Eastern India. What is it? Well, it was developed around 1978, 79. It's a modern green revolution type of rice. But although it's widely popular, it's very susceptible to the flood. So if the flood comes and covers the crop, after 3-4 days, Swarna is going to be really hurt. So the output that you get in the end of the year after that flood is going to be really low. Swarna sub 1, the new technology, the innovation, is Swarna, but they've taken, and let me be an economist, trying not to pretend that I'm actually a plant breeder or a biologist, but from what I understand, they've taken a locus, which is a group of 3 genes, okay, from a traditional landrace that is an old type of rice that had this flood tolerance property in it. They've used a precision breeding technique to move this locus over to Swarna. Okay, so it's a rice to rice technique. It's not transgene, it's not transgenic. Okay, so it took them a long time to figure out how to move this nice sub 1 locus over to Swarna without doing a lot of other things such as making the rice taste bad or other undesirable characteristics that would come over with the flood tolerance. Okay? So it took, the long time that I mentioned was 20 years. So after about 20 years of sort of messing around and trying to figure out the optimal ways, there was, I guess, some innovations in plant breeding, a technique which I know even less about, but which is called marker-assisted backcrossing, is what they finally used to move this sub 1 locus over to Swarna. And again, the key property of this new technology is its flood tolerance. What happens, as I'll show you in a second, what does Swarna want to do when it gets covered up? It wants to grow and grow and grow and grow above the surface of the water so that it can continue its photosynthesis. Well, to put it simply, what Swarna sub 1 does is it just stays put. Doesn't try and elongate. Stays put. When the water goes, it can potentially regrow, well as Swarna, which elongated, maybe survived some, a little bit is very long now and could potentially lodge or fall over in the wind or for various other reasons produce fairly low output. So it's a nice innovation. So the experiment, this was in 128 villages and it was in eastern India. It's in these 2 districts of Orissa state in eastern India, okay? What happened is in May of 2011, we identified 25 farmers in each of these villages. Now there's 64 villages that we call treatment villages. Well, what happened in these treatment villages, 5 of these farmers were randomly picked and they got a small amount of this new seed, this Swarna sub 1 seed, okay? And as controls, that is, we got to compare these people who have this seed to somebody who is a good counterfactual for the people who have these seeds. So we can say, well, what do we think would have happened if these people who have this seed didn't have this seed? Well, these are the randomly selected control farmers, which we take 10 farmers in each of these treatment villages and then 5 farmers in each of these 64 control villages. Well, what happened? Year 1, this was June 2011, they sowed the crop and harvested in December. There was a heavy flood in September. So some farmers got to see how this rice worked. But then rice turns into seed at the end of the year, so you harvest your rice. Then they have a bunch of seed. They can save some of that seed to produce in the next season. Many farmers do this. And then year 2 comes around. No flooding happened. We go back and find out, okay, what did these people do differently on their farm in year 2 now that they've been exposed to this new technology starting in year 1? Okay, that is, how did the technology change their management decisions, and are these impacts large? So where were these villages? They're in, hey, there it is. Okay, let me just give this a second. When it clicks to a high resolution map like this is pretending to be, and tell you where these villages are. This is the Bay of Bengal here, so this is far eastern India, all right? These dots are the villages. The colors are elevation. So you see the villages are all in sort of coastal, low-lying areas. What happens in these areas? Well, these are all higher elevation areas out here, as you can see. There's rivers out here. They flow out to the bay. Well, if there's a lot of rain in a short period of time, these rivers that are flowing out towards the bay get really, really full, and they swell, and they inundate these low-lying areas, here in these coastal low-lying areas. Okay, so flooding is a big deal. It's a big risk for farmers in these areas. In most of these villages, 1 out of 2, 1 out of 3 years, there's going to be a flood event that is a big deal. Okay, so it's not something that happens 1 in 20 years. It's very, very serious. Just to see, you can see where this is in India down here in this little thumbnail. Okay, if you're sort of curious as to what part of India this took place. What was the treatment? I've got a new picture. For those who saw me speak last week, I brought a new person with me. Since we had 320 of these people, I can bring another one of those 320, I think. And what did these farmers get? They got something very simple. They got this sack of seeds, which is 5 kilograms. So it's enough to cultivate about 0.25 acres of land, which it doesn't seem like much, but for these farmers, this is about 14% of their land area. So these are small farmers. Okay, so this farmer's got this sack of seeds, GMS paddy seed. You can't see it here, but it says Swarna sub 1 on it. And they got it right before planting. They also got a little flyer that says, okay, look, here's this variety. Here's some pictures of this variety up against Swarna in some sort of, agronomic trials to show the farmers that, hey, looks good. So they could actually see some pictures. They couldn't see it for themselves, but they could just see pictures to show that the variety looks good. This is all they got, so it's very simple. Very, very simple. So let me tell you about the results just from the first year, about what happened. Again, I said that there was a flood in the first year, and it was in some places and not others. So just by random chance, we can compare, well, how did this new technology perform in the places where there was no flood, where we don't think it's supposed to do anything, right? Because when there's no flood, it's just like what the farmers were growing before. And we can compare that with, well, what happened in places where the flood was very severe, which is where we think the technology should actually work, the places where the flood is very severe. So let me walk you through this. What this shows you, okay, there were places that were flooded for 0 days. There were places that were flooded for some 15 days. What happened? This black line shows you the effect of this new technology. That is, what is the percentage increase in rice productivity or output per hectare that arises from this new technology. And you see when there's no flood, it's roughly giving you slightly less, but not much different than what Swarna was going to give, right? Here is no flood, and it's roughly the same. As the flood increases, though, that is, as you move along the right of the graph, you see that, well, the gain is increasing and increasing and increasing. And then when you get to, say, 6, 7 days, it's pretty sizable. You get up to where the flood is staying on the land for 10, 12 days, which is like the sweet spot for this technology. And the gains are large. It's like a 50% increase in productivity. What does that mean? Well, if a farmer who previously got hit by a 10-day flood was only going to get a ton out of his land, now he's going to get 1.5 tons. Okay? So that's not a small change in income for somebody who only has a small farm. All right? So the productivity, or the sort of pure agronomic gains that are due to just the genetic properties of the seed, are nice. And this was tested as well in trials, in agronomic trials beforehand, so we would have been a little bit concerned if we didn't see something like this. But this was reassuring. Now let me show you a picture, which I think is probably much more interesting for many of this, which shows land that was flooded for about 12 days. And it shows three fields, 3 plots. You can see these plots are, smaller than Manny's backyard. But this is a field that was grown with Swarna. This is another field that was grown with Swarna. This is a field that was grown with Swarna sub 1, the new technology. So visually, this one data point, I am, like I already admitted to, very far from a biologist. but I'm gonna put my vote on this one for looking healthier. Okay, we haven't weighed the output yet with this picture, but roughly speaking, this technology looks like it did pretty well for this particular farmer. Okay, so let me move and speak a little bit about some more of the economic gains that we're thinking of, because as I spoke to already, this is a particular type of technological innovation, right? It's very specific. When a flood comes, there's this genetic property that kicks in, and what does that do? Well, causes productivity to not be as bad as it was before. So there's this pure genetic gain due to what the very skilled plant breeders have done in the lab. Now we want to think about some of the economic gains that are going to come from how do farmers reoptimize what they do, okay? So instead of me maybe just leaving this piece of land that was really flood prone there and not cultivating it because I'm worried that, you know, I might put a lot of effort in that land and it turns out to give me nothing if the water comes and covers the crop. I might cultivate that land, okay? So we can measure that. We can measure that effect with the experiment, okay? And we'll do that all in the second year. For now, we'll do it all in the second year. After the flood came in the first year, they saved some seeds. Second year came, okay? No flood whatsoever in the second year. All normal year, so no shock, okay? So there's no genetic gain in the second year because when there's no shock or there's no flood, it's just like what farmers had. So let me ignore most of this and just walk you through what it means. So we have data. What we do is we go back to these farmers after the season and collect a bunch of data, say, hey, what did you do on your field? You know, how many kilograms of nitrogen fertilizer did you use? How did you plant your field? So some fields, some data we have for every single plot of the farmer. So this is a fair amount of data points. Each farmer has 3 or 4 plots, so 1,200 farmers, we have 4,000, 5,000 data points. And then some observations we have for each farmer. We ask them, you know, what did you do with the rice that you harvested? Did you sell it? Did you save it? They do a combination of those things usually. Some sell it all, some save it all, some are somewhere in the middle. So we can then compare, okay, let's compare what happened for the people who have this new innovation and compare that with the people who don't have this new innovation. Those people are counterfactual. We like it because it's an apples to apples comparison, because those people who don't have the technology were randomly selected, so we can make a nice comparison with the people who have the technology. If we were to just not do this experiment and then go and collect a bunch of data and compare the people who decided on their own to get this technology with the people who decided on their own not to get it, then we have some problems from a statistical as well as logical perspective, okay? So we like the experiment, a lot of work, but we like the experiment from that perspective. We do some statistical analysis, and that's that. There's one sort of small nuance here, is we want to compare the people who we gave the seed to with the people who we didn't give the seed to, regardless of their choice in the second year, okay? So regardless of the fact that some people maybe decided not to continue with the new technology in the second year. Well, we can't go compare only the people who continued with the people who we didn't give the technology to, because then we've got another problem. Okay, so we just have to use our original assignment, even though some people continued or didn't continue to grow the thing. So let me explain what these numbers mean to you in words. All right. So what I say here is that flood tolerance increases the area cultivated. So we asked each farmer, what did you do? How many plots did you cultivate during that second year? Well, I put the important numbers in the red box here. You see that on average, the farmers cultivate around, this is what this means, 3.5 plots. But this 0.68 means that the people who got this mini kit here cultivate 0.68 more plots than the average person who only did 3.5 plots. So maybe it appears that it's true that there is a little bit of land there that they didn't want to cultivate, and so they choose to actually go and cultivate and bring that land into production now that they have this new technology. So we like that effect. Potentially, if we think really, really big and think about economics a little bit, potentially that could impact overall food supply. Maybe, if we really want to stretch, could affect prices, food prices. We don't know about that, and we can't support that. But textbook economic theory would suggest it. We also look at total area, and you can see that on average, this is in hectares. A farmer on this sample cultivates a hectare, and they cultivate about 0.1 more hectares when they have this technology. So it's about a 10% increase in how much area they physically cultivate. So area cultivated goes up. A little bit of information on fertilizer before I talk about what happened with how much fertilizer these farmers chose to use. And some of you undoubtedly know this better than I do, but farmers use 3 types of fertilizer: diammonium phosphate, potash, MOP, I think it's called muriate to something of potash, urea, which is nitrogen. And these things do different things for the plant. My understanding is nitrogen is more sort of for plant and leaf development later on in the stages of the growth cycle, whereas DAP and MOP are generally used early on in the growth cycle for soil conditioning and early plant development. So what this graph is meant to show you is this is true. So this shows you the cumulative, in the first year of the study, amount of fertilizer that was used at or before the date along this x-axis. So what this means is that 0 days after planting, that's at planting, when they planted, of the total DAP that was used, what is this? I don't know, 40, I'm going to call it 51%, something like that, was used at planting. So early, right? Something similar for potash was used early at planting. Urea, nitrogen, as I said, is more for later plant development, leaf development, something along these lines. Used much later in the season. So only a little less than 20% of the nitrogen that was used by the farmers was used at planting time. So moral lesson here, which is important, is the DAP and the MOP are used very early on. This is before farmers maybe know what's going to happen with the flood. Right? When they're planting, they don't know what the state of nature is going to be with the flood. So to keep that in mind, and let me show you what happened with fertilizer during year 2. Let me interpret these numbers for you again. So farmers on average use about 215 kilograms of fertilizer. So it's big. They use a fair amount of fertilizer in India, and one of the reasons why, it's highly, highly subsidized. Fertilizer subsidies in India are like 1% of GDP. So fertilizer is pretty cheap to these farmers. So it's an economic, it's a policy that is an economic, let me just say, probably a disaster, okay? But what it does is farmers use a fair amount of fertilizer already. But with this technology, they use a little bit more. That is, they use about 24 kgs more of fertilizer. But more importantly, it's almost all concentrated. That is, they use about 18 kgs more of the diammonium phosphate and 6 kgs more of the potash. Remember, these are the ones that are used early in the season from the previous slide, before the farmers know what's going to happen. So this is very consistent with what we're trying to push, which is farmers are scared about what's going to happen. They're a little bit apprehensive about what to do. This technology reduces that worry a little bit because their productivity is not going to fall as much. And so they're a little bit more willing to invest a little bit more in their farm. These are not huge. These effects are not massive. Probably partly because of the fact that the fertilizer subsidies make it, it's almost so cheap, you just throw some there. If the flood comes, it's not that big of a deal because the prices are not super high. But nonetheless, there is some crowding in of this particular input. So let me tell you about a couple more things. Well, there's a couple of types of rice that farmers grow. And there's modern green revolution rice varieties, which are very high yielding. Many of you probably know about. They were developed, say the 1950s, 1960s, and they're pretty popular. But they're pretty susceptible. They're very high yielding on average, but they're pretty susceptible to these bad things. If the flood comes, they can be hurt. That is, their productivity can go down quite a lot. Now, there's other types of rice which actually predate the Green Revolution. Farmers have been growing these for a long, long time. They're pretty low productivity, but they're pretty stable. They have this weird, well, not weird, but they have this unique property that they're really good at elongating. They grow really, really high when the flood comes. But if the flood doesn't come, they give you really, really low productivity. So the farmer's trading off a lower variance, right? He's getting a lower variance, but in exchange for that, he's actually getting a lower average productivity too, okay? So farmers still use these, what I call traditional rice varieties. And just to show you that, let's just focus over here. This shows you from year one, as a function of the duration of flooding, the probability that the crop is going to survive, these are of course estimated statistically, as a function of the severity of flooding. And it shows it to you for two types of rice. The traditional varieties, the pre-Green Revolution varieties, and the Swarna, the say Green Revolution variety that Swarna Sub 1 was based on. And you can see that as the flood gets more and more severe, you get this big bump where these old rice varieties, they have a pretty keen way of surviving, okay? So the survival rate is much higher. These results are not experimental. So these are not 100% statistically rigorous, okay? We didn't randomly assign who was going to get this TV to who was going to get this Swarna. So that's a caveat of this. This is just sort of meant to show this agronomic property that is roughly consistent with our data. So farmers might actually go for this traditional type of rice because, they get actually a little bit of trade. They're willing to trade mean for variance in terms of productivity. Another sort of bit of agronomy before I go back to statistics and what this new technology does. There's a couple ways that farmers can plant rice. So we talked about the type of rice. There's a couple ways they can plant it. This is a sort of pretty popular way of planting rice in Asia, which is transplanting. So what you do is you get the seeds, you scatter the seeds in a small area, maybe roughly this area here, in between these tables, maybe a little bit bigger. The seedlings come up, the seeds germinate, the seedlings come up. You get a bunch of people to pull the seedlings, you wrap them up, then you move them to the main field. This is the main field here. You see these bundles of seedlings are here, and you physically transplant the little seedlings. You have to hire a lot of people to do this. As you see, this farmer is hired two female laborers, I should say, to do this process, and they're going along a line and physically. So this costs a fair amount. You've got to hire these laborers. It's not cheap to do. So there's a significant investment early on in the season if you do this. The advantage of this is that by the plants being spaced as they are, it's pretty easy to get the weeds out. So you can weed, and also you get the plants themselves get like a head start over the weeds. So weeds tend to be a far less of a problem with this. So this is a more productive method, but it costs a lot. Now the other way to plant rice is you just take the seeds, you go to the main field, you throw the seeds, you broadcast the seeds, you wait till they come up, then you continue to cultivate the rice. You might need to do some spacing and pull out some seedlings if they've come too close together, but this is another way which is pretty low productivity because of the competition with weeds, but it's also very cheap, right? You just have to take the seedlings, throw, and go and wait. Okay, so it's not that expensive. So maybe what we were thinking is farmers might, before they have this technology, they might really be a little bit more interested in doing this because they're thinking, gosh, the flood might come, it might wipe out my crop. I don't want to hire all these workers to go plant the field and do all this work, and then I lose all that money that I put into planting the field. So they might be more likely to just broadcast the field, as we call it, and sit back and wait and see what happens, okay? So that's roughly true. Let's just focus on these two columns, and let me explain what these mean. Well, it turns out that about 28%, this is this number here, 28%, this lower number in this second column here, 28% of the plots are cultivated using those old traditional types of rice varieties. So they're still there at a fairly reasonable rate. But one of the things that this new technology does is it crowds out or displaces these old varieties. So the probability that a plot cultivated by one of these farmers who got this new technology, or the probability that that plot is cultivated with one of these varieties, is about 4.1 percentage points less when we compare that to somebody who doesn't have the technology. So this might mean that by just displacing this older type of rice, this might increase productivity even when there's no flood, right? Because when there's no flood, the newer rice is definitely better than the old traditional variety, okay?
What is the TB?
TB, traditional variety. Well, you mean there's many of them.
Okay, and the same Swarna, which is a traditional variety in itself, but just specific.
Swarna is actually a modern variety, but the technology definitely displaces Swarna a lot because it's just like Swarna, so they put it on the land that they would have put Swarna on, okay? Now broadcasting, this is again planting the rice like this. So about 19% of plots are planted with the broadcasting approach, but it's a fairly large, if you take the people who have this new technology, only about 19% minus about 6%, 13% of their plots are cultivated using this broadcasting method, okay? So farmers are more likely to invest a lot, that is, plant the field using this more modern transplanting approach. Okay, so one of the other potential ways that the technology could increase productivity is it gets farmers to invest more when they plant their field. All right. Finally, before I sort of finish up, two results. Let me just not talk about the statistics here, so that I can leave plenty of time for questions and answers, and just talk about what this means. Well, more or less, we observed that farmers who have this new technology, if you take the share of the rice that they actually set aside for future consumption and compare that with the share of rice that's set aside for future consumption of the farmers who don't have the technology, it's about 5 percentage points lower for farmers who have access to the technology. So as I was saying earlier, one potential interpretation of this, which we favor, is that farmers are less worried about what's going to happen next year, so they don't need to set aside a huge amount, not quite as much rice after harvest this year. If you do the calculation, farmers save about 70% of their harvest, which means it's enough to feed their family for about 1.8 years, okay? So it's not like they're saving less than they would need for a year on average. They save huge amounts. Now, albeit they could eventually sell that. Rice is storable. You could sell it later on if you turn out to not need it. But nonetheless, one of the things this technology does is push farmers to actually sell a little more after harvest. Okay, final thing. Final thing is that farmers actually, when they have this technology, are more likely to take a loan. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing, we don't want to take a stance on. Okay, but what potentially could be an explanation for that? Well, if you're worried about having a bunch of liabilities, that is, you have to pay back a loan that you use to get your inputs, but you have no crop, that's a bad state to be in. So this technology makes that state less likely, right? You're more likely to have a good crop if the flood comes, or not as bad of a crop. So you have some crop, so you can sell or do whatever with to pay back your liabilities. farmers are actually a little more interested in taking a loan. There's other ways you could think of that or explain that, sort of economically. Maybe the cooperatives that are giving the loan are thinking, this guy's more likely to pay me back because his crop isn't going to be as bad if the flood comes. So we'll be more likely to extend the loan to him. We can't really tell you which story is the right one, but you could think of it that way as well. So let me just, I think the time is getting to where I have about 2 minutes, so I think I'm doing pretty well. Let me just say that now the second year, we can compare the yield across all plots with these people who have the technology or had access to it with those people who didn't. Remember, there's no flood in the second year. So this can't be due to some genetic property of the technology kicking in, because the technology, it's been tested many times, and we saw it in our previous graph, gives the same productivity in the state when there's no flood. You see, this is just a distribution. So the people who actually have the technology, that's the blue line, the distribution of yield shifts to the right, meaning that on average, these people are harvesting more from each plot. And this is due to the fact that they're changing the way that they make their agricultural decisions. They're changing the way they plant. They're using a little bit more input, okay? So the productivity gains from this new technology are not only purely genetic, we have to think about how farmers behave, okay, put the technology in their hands, and then see what they do, and then we can say, well, what are the other sources of gains? And this is how it causes them to re-optimize their decisions. So alternative explanations, I said I wasn't going to talk about, so let me just fly to conclusions. Like I said, with this technology, we see farmers doing a lot of things. They change how much they plant, change fertilizer use, change the way they plant, knock out these old generation traditional varieties, change savings and credit behavior. So in the end, it's a nice technology from a policy perspective due to the fact not only that it's just genetically superior, but it induces farmers to do a lot of things. So where do we think we contribute to sort of knowledge here? Well, there's a lot of research on what are barriers to why farmers don't do things we think they should. And we think they should, potentially use technologies that are profitable and good, we think. But there's a lot of reasons why they don't. Technology, or maybe technology itself, is part of the problem. Maybe we can sort of think about what breeders do and scientists do. Those skills have generated things that are clearly better and superior. Take those to the field, and that pushes farmers to do some of these things that they weren't doing before, okay? So technological progress itself can actually induce greater take-up of some of these agricultural technologies like the way you plant, okay? Fertilizer. And again, this is India, not Africa. So Africa, they use almost no fertilizer. India, they use a lot. So we don't even know what it would be if this was something which was taken and scaled in Africa. So, and I think the key point, again, which I'll just close with, is that relative to the gains from just pure agronomy, if we think about farmers as decision makers and think about how that technological progress changes their decisions, then there's another source of gains that is not trivial, okay? So that's more or less this particular paper. Hopefully there's more to come in the future, sort of building off of this. As a young professor, you always want to keep going and get as much as you can out of a line of research before it gets too stale. But this is certainly the starting point, okay? So I guess I cheated by, I think, about 2 minutes and 7 seconds. So not horrible, but I guess I did okay. So I'll just close at that, and I guess we have a question and answer type session where I'm happy to answer questions. Okay, I'll just circle around, and I guess I'm supposed to give the...
No, you can just
repeat the question. That's it. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
I'm curious as to how behaviors may have changed just because this was a gift. So I was thinking if I received a gift, I would probably take better care of the crops and put more fertilizer onto them, knowing that some educated man from America was going to come back and check on the crops. How do you think the fact that you gave certain people gifts also meant that they didn't have to buy and spend
Yeah.
their personal money on the.
Yeah. So yeah. So the question was, is this partially due to the fact that people were just endowed with something they really liked, which was a gift, and this is sort of an income effect, which pushes them to, maybe they don't have to buy seeds, they have a little bit more money, pushes them to make a lot of these decisions. So it's a good question. It turns out the actual amount of seeds is very small. So 5 kgs is pretty small. So it's still a gift, but it's a small gift. So in terms of actual income, like the cost of these seeds is, say, 75 rupees or something like this. It's half a dollar. $1.50. Okay. So it's not a huge income effect, as we'd say in economics. And also, which I didn't show you, there's actually changes that happen during year 1. So also along the point of your along your line, the lines of your argument is, what could have happened is they harvest a great crop after year 1. Now they have a lot of cash, and then they use that to go and change the way that they manage their farm. That can't be, because what I didn't show you was they're actually doing some things differently in year 1. Now, whether it's due to a gift or not, we can't say for sure. We have some other studies where instead of not giving the control people anything, you give them, Swarna, say, or something. So then it's just the Swarna sub 1 versus the Swarna, so there's no sort of gift. Okay, I think there were several along this row. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess similar to Noel's question, I just have more concern about how the project was introduced to the community. If any information was given that the research was being taken place, or if there was no information given, and why you chose to give it versus kind of introduce it almost in like a sub-market type setting where it was somewhat sold.
Yeah.
Like, how was that?
So there's 2 parts to the question. Mostly, one was, what did farmers know about the research that was going on? And 2, why did we choose to give the seed rather than sell it or do some other way? So to answer the first question, we had to go through an IRV process like you always have to go through with these, where you have to get consent for the people to participate in the research so that they know that research is going on and that people are going to come back and do surveys, so they know they're being studied, okay? And their decisions are being studied. Everybody knows that, regardless of whether you received the seeds or you didn't receive the seeds, okay? And then, let me see, your second question was why we chose to give it out rather than sell it. Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, I would say, let me just focus on one. The main reason is we don't know what the take-up is going to be if we sell it. So it turns out the take-up turns out to be pretty decent, as I found out in a different study. If you actually go and sell it, about 40% of the people will take it. So it's a non-trivial adoption rate. But we're worried that if you get a very low take-up, then you have no statistical ability or no power from a statistical perspective to say anything, because what happens is you have a bunch of people who you offered it to and didn't take it, but you still have to compare those people. And there's some statistical ways to get around this to the people who didn't have the offer. If none of the people who had the offer take it, then you have no ability to say anything. So the worry was if they don't take it at a large rate, research-wise, we'll really struggle.
Yeah. I guess I'm like more concerned with, like, did they know that it was drought resistant, and like, will there be any educational efforts to the farmers themselves that were involved that like this was a drought resistant crop that they could use?
Yeah, so we told them and showed them a pamphlet that showed pictures of the crop and showed that it's flood tolerant, had a flood tolerance property, so that they knew from the crop. They'd never seen it themselves because it's a brand new crop to them, right? And so we didn't give a lot of like hand-to-hand training because we want to actually isolate the effect of the technology and not a bunch of hand-holding that might not be there when we go away, okay? So the short answer is we didn't do that. If you actually look, the farmers who got the technology actually say they're more likely to contact the extension workers than the people who didn't, suggesting maybe they demand some of that. And so they actually went to look for agricultural extension workers at a higher rate to sort of figure out something about this technology. But we wanted to sort of separate things, so we didn't. There was I think another one here, and then I'll circle around. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to dive a bit deeper into some of the like statistical results you drew compared percentages to
to real numbers. So the last slide you had, that had two curves, was real yields. It showed like the kids you get out had
this one.
Yeah. Had like higher yields per hectare.
Yeah.
And then you said there's a percentage decrease in like the amount that you'll save for next year.
That's right.
That percentage decrease, you just like completely assume that they all save 100 kilograms for next year, but people who had the mini kit like just were like started with they harvested 250 instead of 220.
Yeah. So that's right. So yeah, in absolute terms, it's probably going to go up instead of percentages, right? In the savings rate, because these guys now have a lot more, right? So that's definitely true. But if you condition out, you can knock out the effect of cultivating more statistically, sort of include that as a sort of control error would be say, and then you can still see that there is an effect on the level of savings, okay? Interestingly, if you look at this and compare, now think about only the people who have, who don't have BPL card in India. What does a BPL card do? It actually gives somebody access to almost free rice to eat. It's a government program that is also very, very costly, but it gives more or less free rice to families to eat. This savings effect is almost entirely concentrated only on the people who don't have access to this BPL card. So that was another thing we tried to do to almost to get to your question, to sort of tease out whether it's actually potentially really is something about risk and savings. But it's a good thought, and it's a good question, because it's definitely true that the level of savings does go up because they're producing more.
And then just super quick.
Yeah.
Similar, like, did you also control for land price that you were saying there was a 10% increase in amount?
Yes, definitely. Sorry, because it could. Oh well, yeah, roughly, because the question is good because farmers actually cultivate more area, so it could be just entirely mechanical. Yeah, so it's conditional on the amount of area you cultivate. Yeah, good question. Yes, in the back. Yeah, it's still pretty new. So the question, let me just repeat the question. Sorry for the people on the remote. The question was whether there was any documented long-term negative consequences of the technology, or short-term. Short-term, we know a little bit more about that we haven't found any yet. Long-term, we don't know anything about since it was just released in 2009. Okay, so I don't know to what extent the breeding efforts, they sort of tested out these things, but really you don't really know those until it gets actually into the real world. And then I guess there's a follow-up. Yeah. Yeah, so it's not big because it was just released in 2007. 2009. The question was, what's the distribution? Swarna sub 1 is maybe now 3 or 4% of India's land area, which seems small, but it's actually not that small for something that came out recently. But it's not just Swarna sub 1 is another answer. It's that locusts can go to other types of rice that are grown in other countries, and there are many. So it's more about the locust itself than whether it's Swarna sub 1 or IR64 sub 1 or this sub 1, or there's many. There's a sub 1 for Bangladesh, there's a sub 1 for Cambodia. Yeah, back around one right there, yeah.
I want to mention that there's some interesting questions about the gift aspect.
Yeah.
Not just doesn't matter that it was a gift, but does it matter that people realize that somebody will come back and study them? Does it change what they do? And connected to, I know that you also do some observational work. So if it is distributed in India, you can see what people do. If they still they're part of the study, but if they're already using it, the habitual users change their behavior rather than a new user who they're being studied very closely.
Yeah. So the question was, do people sort of behave differently because they're being studied? Certainly, we'd call that like a Hawthorne effect. We always worry about that, always. Now, to the extent that that changes between the people who are being studied and have the technology and the people who are being studied and that don't, we don't know per se. So it's always something we worry about. It's hard to think of the results lining up in the right way If it's that explanation, it seems like they'd be telling you some other stuff which, you know, seem more like nonsense just because they want to tell you they're doing everything great, which we didn't necessarily find. To answer your second question which was about, well, why don't you study people who are growing this in the real world, who have chosen to adopt this technology in the long term? We could, that's a lot harder from a statistical perspective because they've made that choice to adopt it, and then we've got to find the counterfactual for somebody who's made the choice to adopt it, which is a lot harder than it is within the context of the experiment. Yeah?
I'm very much convinced by your presentation within the location
Yeah.
you identified, there are plenty of them, and certainly within the 2-year timeline.
Yeah.
How about if we stress the timeline or move beyond this?
Yeah.
I think of Erie's work, a lot of it comes to mind is in insect pest resistance or pathogen resistance. If you start to impose other kinds of stressors, is the treatment scenario likely, which is the excellent performer in the form of these flooding conditions?
Yeah.
Maybe a weak trade-off and other stressors, farther locations or greater time.
Yeah. So the question is sort of about the external validity of the study, not only spatially but temporally. So spatially, we don't have a lot of other rigorous experiments. I mean, there's a lot of sort of non-experimental comparisons which are encouraging. So spatially, they've sort of haven't found a lot of places other than upland drought areas where there's no flood, where there's no gain. Temporally, again, I would say we know a lot less about, you know, what's going to happen over a longer time frame. Of course, we want to go back to these villages. It's now been 4 years, so trying to dig up a little bit of research money to make that happen, to go back and maybe be able to say something about what's happened over a 4-year period is good. I mean, we almost just sort of have to sit and wait to really say something over a 10, 15, 20-year period. But then the worry is if it does spread, then eventually we're going to lose that comparison. So I don't really have a great answer to, do we really know what's going to happen, you know, over a longer time frame with this technology? Because, you know, we don't. Yeah. Yeah, Colin.
When you mentioned in the very beginning working with this jack of all trades.
Yeah.
I guess I was wondering, because there's such an emphasis on this kind of research.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just spend a couple minutes just talking about what it's been like to work with a multidisciplinary team, what you think you personally benefit from doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 I think that, I mean, there's certainly huge complementarities in skills, and being able to work with somebody who's not even trained in economics is probably better than to work with somebody who's trained in economics, because we're doing field work with farmers, and this is somebody who is trained in entomology, but as their day job is more or less somebody who's responsible for stress-tolerant rice varieties in South Asia, and is responsible for going and talking to farmers and finding out what their issues are and what works for them and what doesn't. Some skill that I, myself, going into this, never had, and I guess roughly barely have now, but maybe have a little bit more of. So it's more like, you know, I'm trained as an economist, so we might sort of cook up some of these ideas and theories about how people's decisions are going to change based on this technology. But one, we don't ourselves know really a lot about the technology itself or the science underlying the technology. So by partnering not only with the co-author, but other people at Erie who are actually scientists and not sort of social scientists or something like that, like myself, we're able to really get a sense for, you know, what they were thinking when they were developing this technology. And even to some extent, you know, they can explain the properties that they think it has. So it's a huge complementarity. It's not easy to do, you know, working in an interdisciplinary team. It requires a lot of, you know, sort of, you have to be willing to think outside of your little, you know, economics lens, which was hard for me as a graduate student, especially because there you're just buried with classes about what economic theory would tell you. And so it's hard to go listen to somebody who's not in that realm, but you know, it really helps to make the project not only go in a way that is helpful for the project, but go in a way that hopefully a more broad audience will be interested in the findings. You know, if it can engage both aspects. Yes.
So you showed that this technology is very promising from the productivity point of view.
Yeah.
You also showed that it's kind of displacing the traditional variety.
Yeah.
Which could be a very valuable genetic resource for future strategies.
Yeah.
You have thought, or have you looked at the long-term effect, possible long-term effect on the displacement of these varieties?
So the question is, you know, is there a potential cost to displacing traditional local land races that have been around for quite some time? So I don't want to speak too far out of my biological knowledge here. So my guess is yes, there probably is, because there's some value to having some sort of diverse group of cultivars grown. In the long term, I mean, I think we'd almost have to go to, I think we'd almost have to take our numbers and apply them to some other study about what the gains and losses are from this sort of genetic diversity. It's not a huge effect, so I'm not too worried. It's not like we're taking these varieties and eliminating them from cultivation. Talking about.
I wonder if in the longer term, these effects, once the technology becomes more widespread, how would that affect the number of varieties traditionally? Because right now it's not very big, but more farmers adopt this technique.
No, I think there will be some displacement of some of these local cultivars, and you know, there's multiple aspects of that. There's, you know, potentially a diversity issue, as you said, but there's also other spillovers which are more economic and less biological, which are, you know, a lot of people depend on the crop to be good, not only the farmers themselves, people who need jobs. So workers might actually have more work opportunities. So the spillovers, which are multiple, I agree, include both the sort of negative ones, as you mentioned, and some positive ones. So it's hard to really say, you know, sort of disentangle and put a number on what those are going to be, I think, especially with a small study and a small, I mean, again, I'm speaking out of my scientific knowledge, but in a small geographic area where there's not a lot of variation in the sort of environment. Yes?
You find that farmers with multiple plots would tend to do some kind of have a mixed strategy with both the traditional variety and the Sarma.
That's a good question. So the question was, do farmers who have multiple plots use a mixed strategy, which is you diversify in a sense. You might grow one plot with the traditional land rates, the traditional variety, one plot with Swarna, and one plot with some other thing, and certainly they do that. So, and we even found that in the next year, the people who stuck with the technology, it's not like they just cultivate all of their land with it. They certainly do not. It's only about 30% of their area they cultivate. So they still keep with these other things because there are other benefits to some of these other varieties. So traditional varieties, they like to eat. They like to, as I said in the previous one last week, they like to use it to make their roof. Okay, they like to use it to feed the cows. So they have this sort of multiple complicated optimization problem, which means that they're not, it's just highly unlikely, and there are very few that take all of their land and put this stuff on this land, because there's other sort of benefits that they have going on that they're thinking about. So, and part of it is diversification.
Sorry, also looks like the traditional variety has less of a risk of completely failing.
Yeah.
Than the
That's right. That's right. Even the traditional variety, and as you remember in that curve where after like 15 days, the Swarna sub 1 still it's gonna start to die. It's not that good, and the water comes and stays for a long time. Those traditional varieties, they can do some stuff, even under like stagnant water conditions. So in these very low-lying areas where the water comes and stays for a long time, they entirely stick with some of these, because even the new stuff is not that good.
I think we're out of